I stood there with my hands folded in front of me, not because I was calm, but because I didn't know what else to do with them. My daughter laughed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel in the way people imagine cruelty. It was quick, casual, almost practiced. Then she said it. "That was your choice." For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. The words didn't land all at once. They came in pieces. That, a pause, was your choice. The room didn't react the way I expected. No sharp intake of breath, no one correcting her, no one saying, "Hey, that's your mother." Someone shifted in their chair, someone else looked at their phone. The moment passed as if nothing important had happened. But something inside me went completely still. I looked at her face, waiting for something, regret maybe, or even defensiveness. Instead, she looked relaxed, certain, like she had just stated a fact everyone already agreed on. My choice. I replayed it in my head, slow and careful, the way you do when you're trying to figure out where you went wrong in a conversation. I wondered if she meant something else, if maybe the sentence had another ending she'd forgotten to say out loud. No one explained. No one filled the silence. I felt suddenly aware of how I was standing, of how small I must have looked, of how long I'd been quiet already. I could have spoken then, I knew that. I could have listed everything, the years, the nights, the things I gave up without ever announcing them. I could have said her name and made her look at me. But I didn't. Because in that moment, I realized something that hurt more than the words themselves. This wasn't an argument. This was a verdict. They had already decided what my life meant. They had already agreed on the story where my sacrifices were optional, where my exhaustion was self-inflicted, where my silence was permission. And I was the only one who hadn't been invited to the discussion. I felt the familiar urge rise, the one that always told me to smooth things over, to stay quiet, to keep the peace even if it cost me something I couldn't name yet. So I did what I had always done. I said nothing. I let the silence sit there, heavy and unanswered. And that was the moment everything began to change, even though no one else in the room noticed it yet. I didn't always recognize myself as someone who gave things up. At the time, it never felt like sacrifice. It felt like responsibility, like doing what needed to be done and not asking for applause afterward. I became a single mother quietly. No dramatic ending, no big explanation to the world. One day, it was just me, a small apartment, and a child who needed breakfast before school. Life didn't slow down to let me process it. It kept moving, so I moved with it. Mornings started early, earlier than I wanted. I learned how to wake up already tired and still function. I learned how to measure time in small units, how long it took to pack a lunch, how many minutes I could sit in the car before going inside another shift, another obligation. I worked jobs I didn't talk about, not because they were shameful, but because they were invisible. The kind of work people assume someone else will always do. The kind that doesn't come with stories you tell at dinner. I remember standing in grocery aisles doing math in my head, quietly, removing items, putting them back, choosing the cheaper version without comment. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself children didn't need much. They just needed consistency, presence, someone who showed up. So I showed up. School meetings, doctor's appointments, parent-teacher conferences where I nodded and took notes and promised to do better, even when I wasn't sure how. I learned how to stretch myself thin without letting it show. When she was younger, she used to fall asleep with her head against my arm, heavy, warm, trusting. I would sit there longer than necessary, afraid that if I moved, something would break. Those moments felt like proof that what I was doing mattered. I didn't talk about the things I wanted. There didn't seem to be room for them. Dreams felt indulgent. Rest felt optional. I told myself there would be time later, that once things stabilized, once she was older, I would come back to myself. Later became a habit. There were birthdays that were small on purpose, holidays that were quiet. I learned how to make less feel like enough. I learned how to smile in photos even when I was calculating how long it would take to recover financially afterward. No one ever said thank you. Not directly, but I didn't need them to. Or at least, that's what I told myself. I believed love was proven through endurance, through staying, through not asking for anything back. Sometimes I noticed the way my efforts were assumed, expected, as if they were part of the background, like electricity or running water, necessary but not acknowledged. If I was tired, it was brushed off. If I was overwhelmed, it was inconvenient. I learned to swallow it quickly, to make my emotions small and manageable. I told myself this was what good mothers did, and maybe that's why I didn't notice when appreciation quietly disappeared, or maybe it was never there to begin with. I just kept going, believing that one day someone would look back and understand what it had cost me. I didn't realize how wrong I was, or how much had already shifted while I wasn't paying attention. It didn't happen all at once. That's what made it harder to name. At first, it was just small things. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room, a pause that lingered half a second too long, plans that were already decided by the time I heard about them. I told myself I was imagining it. I had always trusted my instincts, but I'd learned to question them when it came to family. Doubt felt safer than conflict. Then one evening, I overheard my name. Not spoken sharply, not whispered either, just discussed, calmly, like a topic that had been reviewed before. "She's just been like this lately," someone said. Like what? I wondered. Tired? Quiet? Careful? Another voice answered, "You know how she is. Everything feels bigger to her." I stood there, unseen, listening to my life being summarized in sentences that didn't sound like me at all. No one was angry. That was the strangest part. There was no emotion in it, just certainty. Later, when I asked, carefully, what that conversation had been about, I was met with confusion that felt rehearsed. "What conversation? You're overthinking. We were just talking. Why are you always assuming the worst?" I remember nodding, apologizing even, for interrupting, for mishearing, for making things awkward. That night, I lay awake replaying it, my mind searching for proof that I still belonged where I was standing. The next shift came through my daughter. She started using phrases I had never taught her, words that felt borrowed. "You're being dramatic. Why do you always make everything about you?" The first time she said it, I laughed softly, like it was a joke that missed its mark. The second time, I didn't laugh at all. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she wasn't speaking to me, she was repeating something that had already been said about me. There was a moment, quiet, sharp, when I understood that I was no longer part of the circle where decisions were made. I was the subject, not the voice. No one confronted me, no one accused me outright. They didn't need to. The betrayal wasn't loud, it was organized, subtle, almost polite. I felt isolated in my own family, like I had missed a meeting where everything important had been decided. And still, I didn't fight it. I stayed calm, I stayed quiet. I told myself it would pass, that clarity would come, that love wouldn't let things go too far. But something inside me was already withdrawing, because I could feel it now. This wasn't misunderstanding, this was alignment, and I was the only one standing on the other side. Once they were aligned, everything I said started to sound like a problem. Not to me, but to them. If I asked a question, I was told I was being difficult. If I stayed quiet, I was accused of sulking. If I tried to explain myself, I was making things bigger than they needed to be. There was no correct version of me anymore. I noticed how conversations were framed before I even entered them. Someone would sigh and say, "You know how she gets," as if my emotions were a weather pattern they had learned to prepare for, as if I were predictable in the worst way. I started hearing it directly. You're too sensitive. You take everything personally. No one meant it like that. Each sentence landed softly, but together they formed something heavy, something that pressed down on my chest and made me second-guess the simplest reactions. When I said something hurt me, the response wasn't concern, it was irritation, like my pain was an inconvenience that interrupted their peace. My daughter watched these exchanges closely. At first, she stayed quiet. Then she started nodding along. Then she started speaking for them. "You're always upset," she said once, not unkindly, just observant. "Why can't you just let things go?" I wanted to ask her when she had learned to see me that way. I wanted to ask who had taught her that my feelings were something to manage instead of understand. But I didn't, because every time I opened my mouth, I could feel the room tighten. I could feel the unspoken agreement hovering in the air. Here she goes again. So I learned to edit myself in real time. I practiced swallowing words halfway up my throat. I trained my face to stay neutral even when my heart was racing. I learned how to listen without reacting, how to nod without agreeing. And the more I did it, the more they seemed relieved. See, she's calmer now. See, nothing was wrong after all. I began to doubt myself in ways that felt unfamiliar and dangerous. I replayed conversations late at night, wondering if I had misheard, misunderstood, exaggerated. I asked myself if maybe I was the common denominator. Gaslighting doesn't always sound cruel. Sometimes it sounds reasonable. Sometimes it sounds like people telling you they care right before dismissing everything you feel. I was told they worried about me, that they were just trying to help, that I had changed. I wanted to ask how. I wanted examples. I wanted clarity. But clarity was never offered, only conclusions. And still, I stayed silent, because silence had become my last form of control. If I didn't react, they couldn't accuse me of overreacting. If I didn't explain, they couldn't twist my words. If I stayed small, maybe things would sell. But inside, the tension was building, slowly, quietly. I could feel myself shrinking, not because I believed them, but because fighting back felt too expensive, emotionally, socially, relationally. They weren't yelling, they weren't cruel, they were calm. And that calm made me feel like I was losing my footing, one conversation at a time. I didn't realize then that this pressure, this constant reframing of my reality, was pushing me toward a line I couldn't keep stepping back from. I just knew something was tightening, and eventually, something was going to snap. The expectations changed before I realized the stakes had. What used to be suggestions became decisions. What used to be discussions became announcements. And somehow, all of it happened in my name, without my voice. Money was the first thing they stopped asking me about. I noticed it in small ways. Bills discussed as if I wasn't responsible for paying them. Numbers mentioned casually, like I wasn't the one who had learned how to survive on less. Plans made that assumed I would adjust, always adjust. When I hesitated, even for a second, the room shifted. "Why are you making this difficult? It's not that big of a deal. You always do this." I stopped responding right away. I learned how to pause before answering, because hesitation was now being watched, measured, interpreted. My daughter started speaking with a confidence that didn't come from her own experience. She corrected me in front of others, finished my sentences when I hadn't asked her to, spoke as if she knew my limits better than I did. Once, she laughed lightly and said, "You worry too much. You'll be fine." Fine. That word followed me everywhere. When I mentioned feeling exhausted, it was brushed off. When I admitted I wasn't sleeping well, it was minimized. When my body started reacting, tight chest, constant headaches, it was treated like an overreaction instead of a warning. I was still expected to show up, to provide, to be available, emotionally and practically. But any sign that I was struggling was treated as a flaw, not a consequence. I started noticing how people spoke about me when they thought I couldn't hear. She's just stressed. She doesn't handle change well. She needs to learn to let go. Let go of what? My say? My stability? My right to feel unsettled by decisions I didn't make? Socially, I felt boxed in. If I spoke up, I risked being labeled unstable. If I stayed quiet, I was assumed to agree. There was no version of me that wasn't being interpreted. They expected me to break. Not loudly, not dramatically. They expected me to cave, to give in, to accept the new rules and move on without protest. They waited for the moment I would apologize for being in the way. And the truth was, part of me wanted to. Not because they were right, but because I was tired. Tired of explaining myself into smaller and smaller spaces. Tired of carrying tension that no one else acknowledged. There were nights I sat alone, staring at nothing, wondering when my life had stopped feeling like it belonged to me, wondering how easily my role had shifted from decision maker to obstacle. But even then, I didn't give them what they were waiting for. I didn't cry in front of them. I didn't lash out. I didn't beg to be included. I absorbed it quietly, letting the weight settle, while something inside me stayed stubbornly intact. They thought my silence meant compliance. They thought the pressure was working. What they didn't know was that I was reaching a limit, not the kind that collapses, but the kind that hardens. And once that happens, there's no going back. The moment itself was unremarkable. That's what stays with me. No argument, no final insult, no dramatic line that echoed in my head afterward. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The light in the room was wrong, too bright for how heavy I felt. I was standing at the counter, listening to someone explain a decision that affected my life as if I were a detail that had already been handled. I nodded, out of habit, and then something inside me didn't follow. It was quiet, almost easy to miss, but for the first time, I wasn't trying to understand them. I wasn't trying to see it from their side. I wasn't asking myself what I could do better to keep things smooth. I was just listening. And what I heard, clearly, was this. There was no space left for me here. Not as I was, not as a full person. I felt a strange calm settle in my chest. Not relief, not anger, just clarity. The kind that arrives when you stop negotiating with reality. I realized then that I had been waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for fairness, waiting for someone to notice how far I'd bent. And while I waited, they had moved on without me. That afternoon, I did one small thing differently. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain myself. I didn't even fully admit it to myself at first. I opened a folder I hadn't touched in years, papers I'd filed away when life was about survival, not conflict. I read through them slowly, carefully, as if they belonged to someone else. Later, I made a phone call, not to confront anyone, not to complain, just to ask a neutral question, one I had been afraid to ask before. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel brave. I felt steady, like I had finally stopped leaning on something that was no longer holding me up. I started paying attention in a new way, not to their moods, but to patterns, not to what they said, but to what they avoided. I began keeping my thoughts to myself, not out of fear, but out of intention. Nothing changed on the outside. They still spoke with confidence, they still assumed, they still believed I was exactly where they had left me. But inside, something had shifted direction. I stopped trying to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding me. I didn't need permission to do that. I didn't need approval. All I needed was that one quiet decision to stop explaining my worth to a room that had already decided my value. They thought the story was finished. They had no idea I had just turned the page. It happened in a room where voices were meant to stay calm. No raised tones, no slammed doors, just a long table, neutral walls, and papers laid out neatly, as if order alone could keep the truth from making anyone uncomfortable. I sat there with my hands resting in my lap, listening. For once, I wasn't the one being explained. Someone else was talking now, reading numbers out loud, dates, decisions that had been made months ago, not recently, decisions that didn't match the version of events I had been painted into. I watched faces change in small, involuntary ways. A pause that lasted too long, a brow tightening, someone shifting in their seat like the chair had suddenly become less forgiving. No one looked at me at first. The story they had told so confidently about me being difficult, emotional, unreasonable, didn't fit with what was being laid out in front of them, and the room felt that mismatch immediately. When someone finally spoke, it wasn't an accusation. It was a question. Why wasn't this addressed earlier? The answer didn't come easily. I could feel it then, the subtle shift. Not sympathy, not apology, something colder and more uncomfortable. Doubt. My daughter was sitting across from me. I hadn't looked at her directly until that moment. When I did, her expression had changed. Not defensive, not angry, confused. She glanced at the papers, then at the person speaking, then back at me, as if she were seeing a version of me she hadn't been told about. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The truth has a way of standing on its own when it's finally given space. Someone cleared their throat and said my name, carefully this time, asked if I wanted to add anything. I shook my head. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't need to fight for the floor anymore. Everything I had been dismissed for, my hesitation, my concern, my silence, suddenly made sense in a way no explanation ever could. The power in the room shifted without a sound. I could feel it when people stopped speaking about me and started speaking around me, when certainty drained out of their voices and was replaced with caution. My daughter didn't laugh. She didn't look away either. She just sat there, very still, as if something she believed in had cracked, but hadn't fully broken yet. And that was when I understood something important. This wasn't the ending they expected, but it wasn't the ending yet, because recognition doesn't always come with repair, and the hardest part was still waiting, quietly, just beyond that room. When it was over, no one rushed to fill the space. There were no apologies offered in a clean, satisfying way. No one reached for me or asked how I felt. The room emptied slowly, like people leaving a place they no longer felt comfortable standing in. I walked out alone. Not dramatically, not wounded, just alone in a way that finally felt honest. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Fewer messages, fewer assumptions, a noticeable distance where certainty used to live. It was strange how quickly people learned to be careful once the story they relied on stopped working. My daughter didn't say much at first. She watched me differently, not warmly, not coldly, just attentively, as if she were trying to reconcile two versions of me, the one she had been told about, and the one who had sat calmly while the truth spoke for itself. We didn't talk about forgiveness. I wasn't ready to offer it, and she wasn't ready to ask for it. And for the first time, I didn't rush to close that gap. I let it exist. I let discomfort do its quiet work. I began to reclaim small things, my time, my decisions, my right to pause before answering. I stopped explaining myself unless it was necessary. I stopped smoothing over moments that deserved to stay rough. I let people feel the consequences of their assumptions without rescuing them from the discomfort. There was grief in that, more than I expected, not just for what had happened, but for what I had believed would happen, for the gratitude I thought would arrive someday, for the understanding I thought time would guarantee. It didn't, and accepting that felt like setting something heavy down after carrying it for years. I still loved my daughter. That never disappeared. But love no longer meant erasing myself to make room for someone else's certainty. It no longer meant enduring quietly and calling it strength. Strength, I learned, could be silent and selective. Some relationships don't end with explosions. They end with clarity. And clarity changes how you stand in a room, how you answer a question, how you decide what you're willing to carry forward, and what you're not. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever been told that your sacrifices were simply your choice, if you've ever gone quiet, not because you were wrong, but because you were tired of proving your reality, you're not alone. You don't have to explain yourself here. And if you want to share your story, or simply sit with someone else's for a moment, I'm listening.